Sparta, the place with the worst reputation and the hardest reality check. Today, we're growing a six-pack, stepping into Leonidas' chain of command, meeting the Persians head-on and figuring out what the story of the 300 actually was, without the glossy video game filter. Because here's the problem. Cinema and games sold us a myth. Real Sparta is messier, colder, and way less romantic. And that's the point of this channel. So tell me in the comments, would you honestly choose a one-way ticket to Sparta? Brace yourself, it's gonna get savage. Quick context first. Even the word Sparta is a bit of a historical shortcut that got popular later, largely thanks to Roman usage. If you picture a Spartan shield, you're probably imagining the big lambda on it, the Greek letter lambda. That symbol is a hint. These people didn't walk around calling themselves Spartans. They called themselves Lacedaemonians, tied to the name Lacedaemon. And yes, even historians routinely mess up where the stress goes. Over time, the city name Sparta became the casual label, and the modern name stuck. Second myth, Sparta was a closed city. Not really. Sparta was a state that survived for nearly a millennium, roughly from the 11th to the 1st century BCE. Greece wasn't one country, it was a patchwork of city-states, and Sparta sat in the south of the Peloponnese, in Laconia. That's also where we get laconic from. Spartans were not famous for long speeches. Vasilis is a real Greek name, and it literally translates as king. That's not humble, that's branding. Now, set the clock to around 480 BCE. Sparta is at peak confidence, spreading influence across most of the Peloponnese. Athens is nearby, powerful, and definitely not a best friend. But Athens isn't the real nightmare. The real nightmare is to the east, the Achaemenid Empire, the Persians. They're not interested in Greek internal drama, they're interested in one thing: taking Greek land, all of it. And on paper, Greece should be finished. The Persians have more manpower, more resources, and most importantly, they're unified. Greece is a bunch of small states that only stop arguing when an external threat kicks the door in. The Persians, meanwhile, move like one machine. And yet, spoiler, they lose. Because for the Greeks, warfare is almost sacred, and for Sparta, it isn't a job, it's the entire point of the system. Our Vasilis is what Sparta considers the real deal, a full citizen, one of the homoioi, the equals. Below them are the perioikoi, free people who work and trade but don't get the full citizen status. And at the bottom are the helots, mostly agricultural laborers living in that ugly gray zone between serfdom and slavery. And Sparta's social mechanics are weirder than most places. A household like Vasilis's could have a dozen helots and the land they worked. Officially, helots owed a fixed cut of the harvest. The twist is, unlike many other societies, a Spartan master couldn't just get greedy and raise the cut whenever he wanted. The percentage was locked by law. That's why being a citizen in Sparta was basically winning the lottery, because for every citizen there were around 10 helots, and those 10 very often had one hobby: rebellion.
Helots didn't just get disciplined in Sparta, they got crushed. In fact, the Spartan authorities formally declared war on the Helots on a regular basis, specifically to make mass killing legally clean and keep the entire class permanently terrified. Sounds insane? It is, but that's Sparta, a society engineered around a single obsession: war before comfort, before family, before everything. So imagine Vasilis at 7 years old. Goodbye home, goodbye childhood. He's marched into the barracks and folded into the system. Boys are packed into groups, drilled in fighting, hardened through sport, and surprisingly for the era, taught to read. They're never really alone. An older supervisor is always hovering nearby. They go barefoot year-round, and they don't get seasonal wardrobes. One outfit, summer, winter, doesn't matter. And the diet? That's where the cruelty turns into a prank played by history. Spartan teenagers are fed melis zomos, the infamous black broth, pork cooked in blood with vinegar. It's the kind of food that dares you to swallow. Hunger isn't a bug, it's a feature. Sparta worships simplicity like a religion and strength like a god. Even stealing is part of the program. Teenagers are expected to steal to survive. If you're caught, you're punished savagely, not because stealing is immoral, but because you are clumsy enough to get caught. If you succeed, you get respect. Now, the biggest myth: Spartans threw weak babies off a cliff. That story rides in on Plutarch, writing centuries later, claiming the council judged infants and tossed the unfit into a chasm, no questions asked, no parental choice.
The issue is, ancient writers loved drama. What we can say with confidence is that infanticide wasn't a Spartan exclusive horror. It existed in parts of Greece and Rome too, mostly directed at infants who were severely ill, often framed as ending suffering. And for people who were viewed as not quite meeting the ideal standard but still part of society, the script points to a category known as hypomyonis. Disrespected, yes, but not routinely thrown into ravines. And the famous cliffs themselves have been examined. Archaeologists searched them and didn't find the piles of remains the legend promises. Back to Vasilis. Childhood in this machine is stripped down to survival. Before roughly 12, the boys are basically naked most of the time. They sleep in the barracks on straw mats. When the cold bites, they do something brutal and clever. They stuff nettles into the bedding. The stinging wakes up the body, heats it up, and helps them endure. Then comes the graduation. Around 17, there's a final ordeal tied to the temple of Artemis up in the mountains. It isn't a test of skill, it's a test of pain. A boy is whipped until blood appears. If he breaks and screams, the punishment doesn't ease, it escalates. That's the Spartan diploma. Vasilis survives it. He passes. But here's the twist. Passing doesn't mean freedom. It only means he's allowed to leave the sealed barracks and show his face in public. At 17, he's not done. He's just officially started serving the state. And what does the state pay you with? Sparta treats comfort like a sin, so Spartan diet isn't a metaphor, it's payroll. Per month, Vasilis gets something like 3.5 buckets of barley, 2.5 kilograms of cheese, a kilo of dates, and around 20 liters of wine. Stack that against what we saw with Roman soldiers or samurai in the earlier episodes, and yeah, it's bleak. Money in Sparta is bleak too by design. The lawgiver Lucretius supposedly tries to murder luxury at the root, hoard gold or silver and you face death. Instead of normal currency, Spartans use heavy iron rods, about 625 grams each. Want to buy anything serious? You don't slip coins into a wallet, you drag your wallet like cargo. That's the point. Big purchases can't be hidden. If a deal's that public, people start asking questions. And in Sparta, the most dangerous question is always the same. Where did you get that much wealth?
If you showed up in Sparta as a visitor and tried to spend gold or silver like a normal person, you'd get the same reaction you'd get if you tried paying with monopoly money, a mix of disgust and panic. Sparta deliberately made real money useless inside its borders, and that weird policy did more than scare off luxury. It also made corruption and crime inconvenient. Why accept a bribe if hiding it requires building an entire warehouse? How do you rob someone if their cash is literally heavy iron bars? So Vasia's salary, beyond the sad monthly food ration, includes a handful of those iron rods. They aren't glamorous, but they're enough to trade for something like 10 kilos of meat, basically the difference between barely functioning and dropping dead. And he needs every calorie, because Sparta runs on a brutal rule. 1 Spartan must equal 10 ordinary soldiers. And if you want that slogan to mean anything, you maintain it with relentless training, every day, forever. Now, credit where it's due, the film 300 gets the general vibe of Spartan kit mostly right. A heavy infantry hoplite like Vasilis goes into battle loaded, round shield, helmet, chest armor, greaves. The movie's shirtless Spartans look cool, but it's fantasy. In real combat, bare torso equals dead torso. And it wasn't only heavy hoplites. Sparta also had lighter troops, fighters using spears, bows, javelins, because Spartan boys were trained from childhood to handle weapons across the board. The army's organization was the real weapon anyway. The Spartans perfected straight-line discipline, drilled formations, and a level of physical conditioning that made them look like a different species. Their phalanx, stacked 8 ranks deep, could stretch close to a kilometer. And up until 371 BCE, a lot of people genuinely believed you simply couldn't break it. Not because of magic, but because it was a moving wall that refused to panic. Spartans also leaned into a very specific philosophy. Less engineering, fewer tricks, more forward pressure. They didn't win by clever machines, they won by pushing, harder than anyone else could push. Now zoom back in on Vasia. The year is 480 BCE, and the Persian invasion is the main event. Sparta's king is Leonidas, and yes, he's not a strategist who stays behind. He fights like the rest, right up front. Everyone knows the movie version, so instead of retelling the legend, let's stick to what matters, where the cinema diverges from reality. Put Vasia among the elite 300, the king's personal guard, hand-picked and top tier. They take position at Thermopylae, because geography is the only way a smaller coalition survives a larger empire. Depending on the estimate, the Persian force there might be described as up to 250,000, while the Greek defenders are around 7,000. However you slice it, the ratio is disgusting. And yes, the 300 hold. Not for 5 minutes, for 2 full days, against an enemy that massively outnumbers them. They could have held longer too, if not for a local named Ephialtes, who decided to cash in. He tells the Persians about a mountain route that can slip around the Greek position. But Spartan reconnaissance isn't clueless. Leonidas hears first. And what does he do? He sends the bulk of the army away immediately. Not because he wants a pretty martyr story, but because keeping thousands trapped in a doomed position is stupidity. He stays with the 300. Cold decision, practical decision, and only later does it get wrapped in romance.
In Sparta, the ultimate disgrace wasn't dying, it was backing away. Retreating without a direct order wasn't a tactical choice, it was a moral crime. And here's the trap. Leonidas is the king. There is no higher commander to give him permission to leave. So if he walks away, he doesn't become a survivor. He becomes a name people spit out like an insult. That's why Leonidas stays, and that's why our Vasilis stays with him. But the movie version trims a key detail. It wasn't only Spartans who chose that last stand. Other Greeks volunteered to remain as well, most famously 700 Thespians and roughly 400 Thebans. And there were also Helots alongside the Spartans. We don't get a neat headcount for them, but sources do confirm that during campaigns, Helots were used as a kind of improvised light infantry. So Xerxes didn't face 300, he faced something closer to 1,500. That doesn't make the story less insane. A force this small still inflicted roughly 5,000 Persian deaths, and not just random troops, they also hit elite units like the Immortals. Over the 3-day fight, about 4,000 Greeks die in total, while Persian losses climb to more than 5 times that. And psychology matters here. When an army meets resistance that simply refuses to collapse, the cost of every meter becomes obscene. And the ending isn't everything was pointless. Greece eventually wins the wider war and comes out with a peace deal that's extremely favorable. So don't mourn Vasilis like he got cheated. In Sparta, a hard life is normal, and dying in battle is the closest thing to a crown. There's a brutal story that shows how deep this mindset runs. One of the original 300, Aristodemus, was sick during the campaign. Leonidas orders him away to recover. The king and the guard are wiped out. Aristodemus returns home alive, and Sparta punishes him socially like he committed a crime. They brand him the coward. And even when he later fights with extreme bravery, the label sticks. In Sparta, reputation isn't earned back easily. Sometimes it isn't earned back at all. A year later, 479 BCE, another Spartan, Pausanias, leads the allied Greeks into the decisive clash at Plataea. The Persians still outnumber them by about 3-1, and still they get smashed. Aristodemus fights like a hero, and it still doesn't fully wash him clean in people's eyes. That's how unforgiving Spartan honor culture was. Before we end, one more detail people love because it feels too modern. Spartan girls weren't raised as delicate decorations. If boys were shaped for war, girls were shaped for childbirth, but with training, education, and physical conditioning. They learned to read, they exercised, and their health was treated as a state priority. And in a weird way, you can call Sparta a distant ancestor of certain feminist ideas. Spartan women could handle weapons and carried far more social strength than you'd expect for that era. Which is wild when you remember that in some countries, women only got the vote about a century ago. Progress isn't a straight line, it's a messy graph. Either way, Sparta carved its name into history permanently. That's where we stop. If you liked this Spartan life transformation, hit like and drop suggestions for what era we should jump into next. See you soon, new video coming.